Hello and welcome to this lecture. Today, the topic will be the French Revolution. It began in 1789 and ended in 1799. There are several themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we're going to look at some of the factors that led to the French Revolution, this turning point in the history of Europe. We'll see how common people were involved. It wasn't elites, and it wasn't just members of the middle class who sparked this revolution. In many ways, it was average people. The revolution itself turned bloody and violent, and it also came full circle. What I mean by this is that at the beginning of the revolution, people targeted their anger at the monarchy. Well, we'll see what the people ended up with at the end of the revolution itself. I'd like to begin with a little background to the French Revolution and why it even came about. Toward the end of the 1700s, France faced a major economic crisis and a huge debt. There are a variety of factors that led to this debt, but two major factors deal with American history: the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Remember this slide from lecture number 3? Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, there was a lot of fighting in North America between England and France. The most important of these wars was the French and Indian War, which began in 1754, and the French lost. The French lost this war, and as you can see from this map, there's no purple on it. That identifies the French territory. As a result of the French loss, the French lost their overseas empire, and because this was a world war, they amassed a very large debt as a result of this warfare. Another factor that led to this huge debt on the part of the French government was that the French provided economic aid as well as military aid for the American Revolution. This was crucial to the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown, the last major battle of the American Revolution. The attempts to fund the wars in North America hurt the French economy and led to a huge debt. But another factor was the way the tax system was set up in France. Do you remember this slide from a previous lecture? The tax system in France was terribly ineffective. The bulk of the taxes were paid by the peasants and the bourgeoisie. These were the groups in society that had the least amount of wealth. They also created a tremendous amount of resentment in France because the corvée was something that the French peasants were required to do. They had to work 12 to 15 days of unpaid labor each year for the state because they usually didn't have the cash in order to pay their tax. Another factor hurting the French economy was a series of bad harvests in the 1770s and 1780s. Droughts, hailstorms, and crop failures led to the first famines in France for many years. People took out their anger at the monarchy. People targeted their anger at the monarchy. On the right, we see a portrait of Louis XVI, the King of France. His bride is shown on the left. Her name was Marie Antoinette. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Marie Antoinette, but I've got a hyperlink to the movie trailer on Canvas. You may want to see it. It stars Kirsten Dunst. It's a sympathetic interpretation of Marie Antoinette. Well, she was actually born in Austria, and when she was very young, just a teenager, she moved to France and she married the man who would eventually become Louis XVI. She was young, she had been used to living a lavish lifestyle, and she wasn't very excited about moving to a new area, and so she ended up spending a lot of money on many different things. She spent money on gambling, her wardrobe, her jewelry. Hairdressers would work for hours on her hair. She was known for her extravagance, and she spent so much money. One of her nicknames was Madame Deficit. While she was young and before her children were born, she spent a lot of this money, and people began to target their anger at her because she had spent so much of the taxpayers' dollars, you could say. However, over time, particularly after her children were born, she began to mature. However, people never forgot her frivolous nature when she was young. The King of France was Louis XVI. He was very young and immature. In fact, when he assumed the throne in 1774, he was only 19 years old. Really, he was very young and inexperienced. He also was out of touch with the problems faced by common people. He lived in Versailles and spent very little time with commoners. He was faced with many economic problems, and he just wasn't experienced enough. He was weak and very tentative. In fact, rather than wanting to focus on ruling, he preferred to hunt instead. That's just a little bit of background to the French Revolution. Let's now look at the first phase of the revolution itself. The first phase of the French Revolution is characterized by the ideas of freedom and equality, and it took place between 1789 to 1792. Their slogan was liberty, equality, and fraternity. The first step in the revolution took place because of that economic crisis. Louis XVI needed to increase taxes in order to generate revenue, and members of the nobility refused to pay. The king responded by calling into session the Estates General. That was the name for the French Parliament, demonstrating how dysfunctional the French political system had been for a while. The French Parliament hadn't even met since the early 1600s. As members of the Parliament were in session, events that took place outside of their deliberations had an impact on the nation. In July of 1789, a group of about 800 average citizens made up of housewives, skilled and unskilled workers, shopkeepers, got together and they attacked the government building called the Bastille. Hopefully you remember this slide from a previous presentation. The Bastille was a place where political prisoners were maintained. This was a symbol of the king's power and how the king mistreated people. The citizens in the city of Paris were so angry at the events that they had, and the price of bread had just skyrocketed. So they took out their anger by storming the Bastille and freeing the political prisoners who were there. This group of citizens successfully overran the soldiers who were guarding the building. However, nearly 100 of these individuals died. They became the first martyrs in the cause of the French Revolution. This was a turning point in French history. Average citizens sparked a mass revolution. The storming of the Bastille took place in the city of Paris. However, another event took place in the French countryside. There was a rumor that went throughout the countryside, and the rumor was that members of the nobility were going to try to destroy all the crops in the rural areas in order to undermine anyone who was trying to support the revolution. The peasants responded with violence of their own. They looted and destroyed many of the homes of the nobles in the communities where they lived. The nobles were fearful of what was going on, and they realized that this uprising was spreading throughout the entire countryside. So what they did was they went out in public and they renounced all of their traditional privileges that had been in place for centuries. Taken together, we see the storming of the Bastille involved people in the city of Paris. The Great Fear took place just after that, and it showed that people in rural areas were helping to destroy the status quo, the way things had been for centuries. And this painting shows common people destroying the old order with this mass uprising. Due to the violence in the city of Paris as well as the countryside, the revolution took a new twist. And we'll see the adoption of a brand new constitution and a new calendar as well. So the storming of the Bastille took place as the Estates General was meeting. Well, the delegates to the Estates General decided that they would form a new organization, and that was called the National Assembly. In a way, this National Assembly could be kind of similar to the Constitutional Convention, which was held in the United States in the 1780s. Essentially, what they did was they decided to meet to establish a new order in their nation. One of the first steps that the National Assembly took was to create a document which would provide a philosophical statement as to what the foundation of this new order would be. This was called the Rights of Man. In a way, it's kind of like the Declaration of Independence or maybe the preamble to the United States Constitution. At its core, the ideas included in the Rights of Man was that every man was guaranteed natural rights and should be treated equally. Notice they said every man, not every man and woman. After several months of deliberation, the National Assembly was able to adopt a new constitution. They decided to keep the monarchy, but they wanted the monarch to have limited powers. So they had a constitutional monarchy, but there was a national legislature as well. The national legislature would be a check on the actions of the monarch. Clearly, the old regime was gone. Society was going to be based upon freedom and equality. There would no longer be members of the nobility and peasants. There were no traditional privileges that had been in place for centuries before. An important concept included in this new constitution was that just about all adult males had the right to vote. Not women, however. And an additional change that came about as a result of this new constitution was they decided to adopt a new calendar. Some of the provisions of this new calendar were quite radical. Because the French Revolution was such a transformative event, and it took place in 1789, they decided that 1789 would be the new year one. They were starting with a brand new society, therefore that should be the first year. They would continue to have 12 months in a year, but each month would be uniform, it would be the same. Each month had 30 days. Also, each month had 3 weeks. Each week included 10 days. Instead of having a 2-day weekend that we have today, they decided to have a 1-day holiday for each week. In many ways, the new calendar was seen as radical because it appeared to be an attack on Christianity, and I want to show some examples. First of all, 1789 is the New Year one. Well, this seemed to attack the BC or AD dating for before Christ and in the year of our Lord, because it's believed that Jesus was born about 4 BC. They tried to get Jesus' birth at the year 1. However, it's complicated to make calendars, and so it's believed that he actually was born in 4 BC. Also, the 10 days a week in the new calendar, that seemed to attack the idea of the 7-day week. The earth and the universe, according to the Old Testament, was created in 6 days, and then God rested. And one of the provisions of the 10 Commandments required that once every 7 days, they hold a Sabbath, and that was not going to be allowed under this new calendar. I'd like to harken back to another presentation. Remember Deism? Deists believed in God. However, they saw God as a divine watchmaker who never became involved in events again once the earth and the universe was created. Well, this new calendar adopted by the French, it reflected the influence of Deism with its attacks on Christianity. Those are some of the highlights of the first phase of the French Revolution based on freedom and equality. Key events included the adoption of a new constitution and new calendar. Now we'll move to the second phase, based on terror. Phase 2 of the French Revolution could be characterized by this image here. It turned bloody and violent between 1792 and 1795. The reason why it turned bloody and violent is because of war. What happened is that France was engaged in a war against just about all of the other nations in Europe. Other European nations saw that society was being turned upside down, and they didn't want to have a revolution in their own country, so they ganged up essentially against the French and fought against them to try to bring an end to this revolution. Supporters of the revolution in France were very threatened by these actions because they thought all of the accomplishments of the revolution might simply be gone. So, to wage war and to protect the values of the French Revolution, the national legislature gave a tremendous amount of power to a committee of its members in order to protect the revolution and to fight this war. The head of the Committee on Public Safety is shown here. His name was Robespierre. He was an excellent public speaker, very effective, speaking with large crowds of people, and he was a true supporter of the French Revolution. He believed in equality based on birth, and he wanted to make sure that those values that were included in the new Constitution were protected. The Committee on Public Safety was charged with the defense of France. They implemented a controversial policy called the levée en masse. Essentially, everyone in society was required to contribute to the war effort. This meant men, who could be serving as soldiers. Women could help with the war effort by producing clothing and food and other items for the war. Children even were expected to participate as much as they could. There could be no dissent. Anyone who even spoke negatively about the war might find themselves imprisoned. They might find themselves in trouble. All dissent in society was crushed. It's believed that between 25,000 to 50,000 people were killed because they questioned the war effort. Several 100,000 were also imprisoned. A brand new device was invented during the French Revolution and popularized by a doctor named Guillotine. This was designed to try to execute people in a humane manner because of the blade and the weights and the pulleys that were involved. If someone was to be executed with a guillotine, their head would be chopped right off and they would die instantly and they wouldn't feel any pain. It's estimated that between 25,000 to 50,000 people were executed using the guillotine, and it came to symbolize this reign of terror. As the Committee on Public Safety was trying to mobilize the defense of the nation, and the French armies were fighting different European countries, the King of France was corresponding with leaders from other nations. He was asking for their help so that he could be restored to the throne with the full powers of the throne. At one point, he tried to escape. This is called the flight of the king. He later was captured. Following his capture, Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. He was convicted, and he was executed in January of 1793. Later that same year, Marie Antoinette was put on trial. She was convicted of treason, and she too was executed. Some people probably were collaborating and they were maybe undermining the French war effort, and they probably were guilty of treason. However, hundreds and thousands of innocent people found themselves in prison or faced execution as a result of the hysteria associated with these accusations in the Reign of Terror. It demonstrated that during this Reign of Terror, things really got out of hand. The mass imprisonment of large numbers of people in France, the executions, not just of the king and queen, but of people who just made slight comments at times about how they were tired of the war effort. All of these demonstrate the terror associated with the French Revolution and how the revolution turned violent and bloody. Even Robespierre himself fell victim to the guillotine. The other members of the National Assembly realized that Robespierre had given in to this hysteria. They tried to stop him, but eventually they convicted him of treason, and he was executed himself. The execution of Robespierre ended the Reign of Terror. That brings us to the last phase of the French Revolution, and that's called the Directory. In response to the hysteria caused by the Reign of Terror, leaders of the revolution wanted to avoid a similar situation from happening again, so they adopted another new constitution. This one would ensure that there would not be any Reign of Terror. At its foundation, all male landowners would continue to have the right to vote. However, power would be held by 5 individuals who were called consuls. One of those consuls was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's background and rise to power will be covered in more detail in a subsequent lecture. However, he was a popular war hero, largely due to his actions in Egypt as he was fighting in the wars of the French Revolution. Napoleon was very popular among the French people, and he had the support of the military. Well, by 1799, he essentially staged a coup. He took over the Directory and abolished it, and he installed himself as the sole leader of France, essentially bringing an end to the French Revolution. Well, we've talked about many of the highlights associated with the French Revolution. Now I'd like to ask you to think about how it should be evaluated. In many ways, the French Revolution came full circle. The goal of the rebels early on was to destroy the monarchy and the old regime and the privileges that members of the nobility had. The end result, however, was there was one ruler, and this was an emperor named Napoleon. Even though they ended up with an emperor, they did create a society in which all male landowners had the right to vote. Society was more equal. However, not everyone had full equality. So what I'd like you to think about was, overall, was the French Revolution positive or negative for the people of France? Yes, there was a more equal society. However, at what cost? How many people had been imprisoned or executed or died in the wars? Something to think about. Well, this lecture hit some of the highlights of the causes and the key events associated with the French Revolution. I hope you learned something new today. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.